game and I fucking lost it. Still you cry. Wish I had a heart. At least I could die. Please somebody take my mind off my mind. Just for living, I'm taking my own life. Tomorrow's gonna be too much. And the joke will the rush. I'm here to stay. I am never going nowhere. So stay the fuck away when it comes to fitting. I'm a martyr. You just don't know, really. You don't wanna go there. Simon really nailed it. The hurt gets worse and the heart gets harder. Please somebody take my mind off my mind. Just for living, I'm taking my own life. Tomorrow's gonna be too much. And the joke will the rush. 'Cause I drink alone. Cause I drink alone. Cause I drink alone. Cause I drink alone. It takes a minute to learn. It takes a lifetime to master. I don't wanna master a goddamn thing. I just wanna forget everything faster. Please somebody take my mind off my mind. Just by living, I'm taking my own life. Tomorrow is gonna be too much. And the joke for the rush. And the joke for the rush. And the joke for the rush. I drink alone. I drink alone.
Welcome, everyone, and I know this was a bit short notice, but I don't know if there's going to be a live stream later. I kind of have the Dallas game to watch tonight, which, with all due respect, is more important than you guys. Just kidding, but it's at 8 o'clock tonight, so it might be very late to do a live stream, and I haven't done an afternoon live stream for a while. Of course, if you're looking at the chat, we have Arjun here. Thank you again. I haven't been in touch with him, but I didn't forget about you. But we're talking today a lot about the ramifications of the Kavanaugh hearing. And the last one, well, that's a good suggestion, Arjun, Dropkick Murphys. But the last song was I Drink Alone by the Cum Shots, which I think for a song that I didn't find until, so here you can see I was looking for a way to play George Thorogood, but I mean it's unfortunately blocked everywhere if I use it, so that's why we had to go with that other version. It's not even a version of the same song, it's just a different song with the same name. But I mean, at this point, after all of this, pussyfooting around by politicians and everything, can't we all agree that we need some like real hard rock back for really to like restore the spirit of, the rock and roll lifestyle to the country? Isn't that important enough that we should try to, I remember 15 years ago, if you would put, or maybe not 15 years ago, I didn't discover them by then, but to bands like Tool, bands like Korn, bands like Deftones, those were bands that were really, they were the leading edge in music. And if they came out today and put out music with that type of lyrics, or that type of I guess even the style of music, the hard driving, heavy guitar and drums and everything, basically hard rock, they would be considered a microaggression, possibly more than a microaggression. I mean, let's really think about it. So please share this stream with everybody. I know this is on the second channel, and I will hopefully upload a version of it, or maybe a cut up version of it, to the main channel, which is Bold Like a Leopard. Subscribe to Bold Like a Leopard if you're not subscribed yet. Subscribe to this channel as well if you're not subscribed yet. We're going to talk a little about some of the people who are going to be winners, or are already winners or losers, from the confirmation of the Honorable Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. He's now Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh. And I think that if there's one thing that the Democrats did with regards to Kavanaugh, they did not actually increase opposition to the judge. What they might have done is that they increased support for him, because people like me, if you know what, I'll pull up this video and I'll play some of it. I don't know if I'll play the whole thing, because you should go watch it on your own. And I'll probably have ads on this because this is my second account. So Ben Swan made an excellent video on Brett Kavanaugh. That these are some actual important
the circus
considerations to take when you're looking at this judge, and in fact, he made a great case to why he shouldn't have been on the Supreme Court, and they had nothing to do with his personal life, or Roe versus Wade, or the drinking problem, or anything. Here, watch some of this.
That has surrounded the Brett Kavanaugh nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court has been drowned out by 36-year-old uncorroborated accusations of sexual assault. Now, do you support Kavanaugh's nomination? If so, you likely do, because you know almost nothing about his record, but you feel for him personally. Do you oppose Kavanaugh? If you do, it's likely for the very same reason. But today, we're going to tell you why, for constitutional reasons, Brett Kavanaugh should likely not be a Supreme Court justice. Is Brett Kavanaugh actually an enemy of the Fourth Amendment? Let's give it a reality check.
Reality Check with Ben Swan, powered by Smart Cash.
Well, all of the noise around the Brett Kavanaugh nomination to the Supreme Court has really accomplished only one thing. It has prevented any real concerns over Kavanaugh's history and view of the Constitution. Today, 3 reasons why Kavanaugh should likely not be on the U.S. Supreme Court. Number 1, the Patriot Act. You may or may not know that during the time of the September 11th terror attacks, Brett Kavanaugh was an associate White House counsel for then President George W. Bush. Now, he was instrumental in helping to draft and create one of the most unconstitutional laws ever passed in this country. We're talking about the Patriot Act. According to the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the Supreme Court Justice nominee in emails at that time referred to the Patriot Act as, quote, measured, careful, responsible, and a constitutional approach. He has been definitively credited with the line, quote, the new law will update laws authorizing government surveillance, which demonstrates one very important thing, that the Fourth and Fifth Amendment protections of due process and protections against warrantless searches and government surveillance is something that Kavanaugh believes could be updated in the Constitution. As the Foundation for Economic Freedom points out, quote, anyone who knows anything about the Patriot Act knows that constitutional and careful are by no means accurate descriptions. The Patriot Act obliterated the Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights to privacy and due process by giving the federal government sweeping new powers to conduct surveillance on the American people, end quote. Number two, his role in the U.S. torture memos and enemy combatants issue. Now, while in the Bush White House, Kavanaugh was involved in two very important discussions, the first of which surrounded the use of torture by the administration. In 2004, a series of memos which were originally composed while Kavanaugh served the Bush administration, well, those were released. And in short, these memos told a story of members of the Bush administration attempting to broadly expand the legal definition of torture to justify waterboarding and sleep deprivation as being permissible. Those memos also detailed the Bush administration's attempt to seek the authority to label anyone of their choosing, anyone, as an enemy combatant, thus subjecting them to the possibility of indefinite detention in facilities like Guantanamo Bay. While undergoing his nomination to the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit in 2006, Kavanaugh testified that he knew nothing about these memos or the attempt to frame a legal argument for indefinite detention, saying this, quote, I think with respect to the legal justifications or the policies relating to the treatment of detainees, I was not aware of any issues on that or the legal memos that subsequently came out. This was not part of my docket, either in the counsel's office or as staff secretary, end quote. But in 2007, the Washington Post reported that in 2002, there was in fact a contentious meeting in the White House over whether the Supreme Court would allow the enemy combatant to be used for any American the government deemed an enemy, and that now Judge Kavanaugh was not only present at this meeting, but was specifically summoned to weigh in on the matter since he himself was a former clerk for the swing vote judge, Justice Anthony Kennedy. At the meeting, he reportedly voiced his concerns that Justice Kennedy and other swing voters on the Supreme Court would never side with the administration's controversial decision to label any person, any American citizen, an enemy combatant. Number three, Kavanaugh apparently doesn't believe in privacy. Now, no doubt you remember when Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor, revealed this massive spying program that had been underway by the federal government for years, spying on and gathering information on virtually every American citizen. Well, during that time, Judge Kavanaugh, he was and he still is on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. It's the second most powerful court in the nation. But it was in this position that Kavanaugh sided with government mass surveillance, stating that, quote, the government's metadata collection program is entirely consistent with the Fourth Amendment. He also later stated that, quote, critical national security need outweighs the impact on privacy occasioned by this program, end quote. See, Judge Kavanaugh, simply put, believes that
Okay, and I think that if you watch that clip, and I'll put it in the chat, so you can go watch. There's only 2 more minutes left, and they include kind of one clip of Judge Napolitano. Judge Anthony, what's his name? Anthony Napolitano going through this as a law school class. It does give a compelling case to why Judge Brett Kavanaugh should have been, there were red flags against him in terms of his beliefs regarding the Bill of Rights. And those were the real issues that were concerning me, concerning other people. I said several times during the confirmation process that I wasn't really enthusiastic about Kavanaugh getting on the bench of the Supreme Court. I thought it was not the best choice at all, and probably a bad choice, in fact. And when he was first nominated, I actually said that Senator Paul, who's probably the only senator that I really think represents my views, who's from Kentucky, and we'll talk about him later. I said if he really wants to stand for his principles of civil liberties and the Bill of Rights, he should vote against Brett Kavanaugh. And that was at the time. That was in July. That was in July before all of this retarded circus happened. And unfortunately, none of this was discussed, just like Ben Swan says. It really is kind of, it's a charade, all these hearings. They discussed literally nothing important. A lot of these Republican senators kissed his ass the entire time. And then the Democrats basically treated him like he's some sort of, Ming the Merciless come to destroy the world, destroy the universe. Sorry, it doesn't make any sense. You have to judge people based on who they truly are and what they do, not based on aspersions that you cast, based on nothing. It's just ridiculous, and I found it like really to be a revelation of how broken our political process was. Yes, the Republicans were slightly better. John Cornyn especially impressed me as somebody who at least discussed. John Cornyn and a couple of the other Republicans did impress me. The majority of the Republicans were, kind of the same idea. John Cornyn and Orrin Hatch, who are some of the oldest people on that Senate Judiciary Committee, kind of distinguished themselves in that they were saying, look, we're not exactly thrilled about everything, about every nominee, but if they're qualified to sit on the bench, we do want to vote for him or whatever. And I think that they did make a case that there was nothing directly incriminating about Kavanaugh that would prevent him from being confirmed. Now, these also happen to be people that agree with Kavanaugh's views on a lot of these issues that Ben Swan and people like myself object to, but they have the right to disagree. I think that they happen to be wrong on issues of the Fourth Amendment, but nobody really made an issue of the Fourth Amendment. It was kind of an unspoken. It never even made like a serious foothold onto the Supreme Court hearings because the Democrats were too busy talking about their vaginas. And indeed, I'll pull. This is not from the Kavanaugh hearing. This is from Neil Gorsuch, who was nominated in 2017 and was the last justice appointed to the Supreme Court, who now is kind of an afterthought because nobody's even paid attention to it up until the present day when Kennedy resigned or retired, I guess. It says, today, U.S. Senator Kamala D. Harris released the following statement on her vote on the confirmation of Judge Neil M. Gorsuch to be Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Written above the doors of the Supreme Court are the words, equal justice under law. A reminder that the court exists not to protect the powerful, but rather to uphold the rights of all Americans. Whether or not the Supreme Court lives up to that ideal depends on the appointment of jurists who understand the profound impact of their decisions on individuals and on our society. After 4 days of hearings and a careful review of his record, I concluded that Justice Gorsuch is not that jurist. Judge Gorsuch's deeply conservative views put him well outside the mainstream. Despite his claim to interpret the law without fear or favor, Judge Gorsuch has consistently sided with corporations and wealthy interests. And he has just as consistently ruled against women, against workers, against the LGBT community, and against Americans with disabilities and special needs. Judge Gorsuch may understand the text of the law, but he has failed to demonstrate that he fully understands the meaning of equal justice under law. So notice what she's trying to say. She doesn't actually cite the cases where Gorsuch may have issued rulings that were unlawful or that were contrary to the Constitution. Instead, she makes a blanket statement that he serves corporations and wealthy interests. Now, I'm not going to say that Gorsuch doesn't have a bias in his head because I don't know the guy personally, and I haven't studied his case docket either. But this is not an explanation as to why he is violating the principle of equal justice under law. There happens to be the possibility in going into every trial that the defendant wins and that the prosecution wins. Often it has to do with how skillful your legal counsel is and how you're able to, a lot of courtroom gamesmanship and stuff like that. And by the time you make it, let's say you appeal it up to a federal court level, which is where Gorsuch was, that kind of stuff kind of gets thrown into the trash, because at that point it becomes a question of, is it truly a matter that is the lower court ruling truly consistent with the Constitution? Okay, and you can see that in the Colorado cake case with what's his name? I think his name is James Phillips or Steve Phillips, Jack Phillips. That's his name. The Jack Phillips case. Yes, there was actually it was a state agency, the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, that thought that they were going to enforce equal justice under the law by pursuing this cake shop owner and saying, well, you can't run your business the way you want to. We're going to step in and tell you either bake the cake or, close up or pay a hefty fine. And they were trying to enforce their version of equal justice under the law. And in reality, what the court found, and you had 3 different opinions as to why the Colorado Civil Rights Commission was wrong. Those 3 opinions showed that they really outstepped their bounds. That they actually, it wasn't even a matter of the law. They were actually enforcing the law selectively on this person in order to attempt to impose a set of values on people that simply were trying to get on with their lives. And I'm not one of these, if somebody were to come to a bakery and say, bake this cake that, I don't care what the message is. The baker should have the right of refusal, even if it's a stupid one. If somebody, let's say you live in Kansas and there's 2 big football teams in Kansas for college football fans. Those of you that know, those of you that don't, I don't care. There's the Kansas Jayhawks, the University of Kansas, and then there's the Kansas State. I think they're not the Wildcats. I think they might be the Panthers. But in any case, if somebody comes in and they're a Jayhawk fan, they want a Jayhawk cake, and the baker happens to be a Panther fan, and they can say, well, no, fuck you. I roll with the Panthers, KSU forever. That's a very simple, and I would say, fine. If they want to lose that business, if they want to lose the business of all the Jayhawk supporters, okay, if this were in Ohio where I live, it would be Ohio State Buckeyes versus or the Ohio University Bobcats, okay? And there's much more business there's much more of a following for the Buckeyes than the Bobcats. And if you were a Bobcats fan, which, it's not like there's a huge rivalry between them because they're in different conferences, but you said, well, I went to OU, fuck the Buckeyes, they could potentially be losing out in a lot of business, and that's their problem. So that was Kamala Harris's statement on this, and I think it really shows how vapid and stupid her belief system is. And here are some other takes on this. This is from Senator Collins. I think this is kind of a random point in the speech, but this is her 43-minute speech that kind of broke the momentum of the Democrats.
A presumption of innocence. In cases in which the facts are unclear, they would argue that the question should be resolved in favor of the nominee. Mr. President, I understand both viewpoints. This debate is complicated further by the fact that the Senate confirmation process is not a trial. But certain fundamental legal principles about due process, the presumption of innocence.
Yeah, this was the wrong way to come into this, but this is 45 minutes, which, by the way, I do link to it in the description.
We have come to the conclusion of a confirmation process that has become so reflected in the fact that he and Chief Judge Merrick. Mr. President, I understand both viewpoints. This debate is complicated further by the fact that the Senate confirmation process is not a trial. But certain fundamental legal principles about due process, the presumption of innocence, and fairness do bear on my thinking, and I cannot abandon them. In evaluating any given claim of misconduct, we will be ill-served in the long run if we abandon the presumption of innocence and fairness, tempting though it may be. We must always remember that it is when passions are most inflamed that fairness is most in jeopardy. The presumption of innocence is relevant to the advice and consent function when an accusation departs from a nominee's otherwise exemplary record. I worry that departing from this presumption could lead to a lack of public faith in the judiciary and would be hugely damaging to the confirmation process moving forward. Some of the allegations levied against Judge Kavanaugh illustrate why the presumption of innocence is so important. I am thinking in particular not of the allegations raised by Professor Ford, but of the allegation that when he was a teenager, Judge Kavanaugh drugged multiple girls and used their weakened state to facilitate gang rape. This outlandish allegation was put forth without any credible supporting evidence and simply parroted public statements of others. That such an allegation can find its way into the Supreme Court confirmation process is a stark reminder about why the presumption of innocence is so ingrained in our American consciousness. Mr. President, I listened carefully to Christine Blasey Ford's testimony before the Judiciary Committee. I found her testimony to be sincere, painful, and compelling. I believe that she is a survivor of a sexual assault and that this trauma has upended her life. Nevertheless, the 4 witnesses she named could not corroborate any of the events of that evening gathering where she says the assault occurred. None of the individuals Professor Ford says were at the party has any recollection at all of that night. Judge Kavanaugh forcefully denied the allegations under penalty of perjury. Mark Judge denied under penalty of felony that he had witnessed an assault.
Okay, so you might have seen all of this or some of this before, and I think it is it's one of the few moments in my recollection that I think that Susan Collins said something that was really logical, and she just lays it out, and it was probably the biggest moment to torpedo the Democratic effort to sink the Kavanaugh nomination. And really, this is the first person that we can call a winner from this whole nomination process. Because honestly, until now, Susan Collins was thought of among conservative voters and the GOP base, not necessarily the GOP as an organization, but the GOP base. She was thought of as the Planned Parenthood senator, the senator who helped kind of take the wind out of the sails of passing the Obamacare repeal. She has never, in my memory, again, ever helped any cause that I've ever supported because she's one of these corporate Republicans. She'll vote for a lot of these big businesses and whatever and she is kind of the embodiment of some of the accusations that the Democrats have made against Gorsuch and against Kavanaugh, and there are credible reasons why you should oppose a Supreme Court pick, and yes, if you're somebody like Kamala Harris or Richard Durbin from Illinois, I can understand you not voting for Brett Kavanaugh because you disagree with some of his positions on corporate law and stuff like that. But this was really ridiculous. It was kind of a parody of how the law should be. And instead, we're getting these people who are, I'm going to roll this back. This is from the Real News Network. And they're talking about this whole charade. And these are the people who don't call themselves corporate Democrats. These are the clowns that say, well, we're actually the progressive wing, and we oppose the Democrat. Can they not see how they've been taken for a ride? How many times can they basically say, well, we're not really the Democratic Party. We actually adhere to a more principled stand on most of these issues. And then they actually take the bait and they support the Democrats on this ridiculous issue just because Kavanaugh happened to be, they could have opposed him the entire time based on his views, just like Ben Swann did, but they didn't.
When thousands of people were occupying the Senate Hart Building, and it was a fevered pitch opposing this nomination, and then we.
So this is Mark Steiner from the Real News Network. Let me just reload this.
A Supreme Court Justice of the United States, a permanent lifetime position.
So I'm going to come back to that because, I mean, there's a real leap here between the events of yesterday when thousands of people were occupying the Senate Hart Building, and it was a fevered pitch opposing this nomination, and then we see Susan Collins in her speech today, which really was kind of night and day in terms of what we can expect. So I'm going to get to Paul, but I just want to do your reactions to that, since you were in the midst of all that yesterday.
Well, Senator Collins' comments today, her statement on the floor that I listened to this afternoon was very disappointing. If she heard the voices of Americans who were there, who were in the Senate building yesterday, who were at the Supreme Court speaking out, people from all across the country, from Maine, from Alaska, from West Virginia, from Nebraska, from Maryland, talking about why this is so important and why we need to have our senators vote no for this nomination. And that Senator Collins brought up Dr. Ford's testimony, her review of the FBI report, the abbreviated FBI report, and concluded, based on that, not thinking about the process, not addressing the process, which the leadership of the Senate endorsed and advocated for, which is where so much of this problem and this challenge with Judge Kavanaugh's nomination really began. Not to mention that basically this is a job interview, and Judge Kavanaugh clearly showed that this is not the job for him. He doesn't have the temperament. He doesn't have the way to talk to people, to be impartial about decisions that he will make if confirmed. And this is a lifelong appointment. There should have been plenty of time to review the background materials, to have a full FBI report, et cetera, so that we could know whether or not this judge is appropriate for this. Again, this is a lifetime position.
Let's go to the tape here. We want to play what we're calling here SOT 20, which has to do with the issue of due process. Let's watch this together.
But certain fundamental legal principles about due process, the presumption of innocence and fairness, do bear on my thinking, and I cannot abandon them.
She cannot abandon them. Paul J.
Well, this is the underlying argument that all the Republicans are giving. and they're trying to have it two ways. You can't demand due process and presumption of innocence if you don't also demand what a central part of due process, which is called a police investigation. The presumption of innocence comes that the state.
Okay, so what he's saying here is that you can't have due process unless you investigate a crime that's 36 years old, that there's no forensic evidence, there's no video evidence, there's nothing. There's no, the testimonials of other witnesses aren't there. You cannot, and the account itself by Blasey Ford doesn't give any specifics or particulars. So these are people at the Real News who I've been following for about 3 years, who basically believe that in any other situation, they believe that the police and the FBI and any other law enforcement organization is some sort of totalitarian, secret police. And in this case, they're saying, well, how about now, because the allegation has been made, we basically stop the entire world and pry into this person's, personal life for an unknown amount of time. And they think that that's really what due process means. It's not. In order to actually create, to give a good foundation for an investigation, first of all, typically you need things like a warrant in order to do searches, and you need things like probable cause if you don't have a warrant. Where is the probable cause here? And what are you supposed to search? All you have are these witnesses. You don't have a location, you don't have a date, and you don't have anybody who's come forward and said, well, I was there too, and I saw Brett Kavanaugh do X, Y, and Z. It doesn't exist. So these people are employing basically the principles of investigation on a foundation of nothing, when usually they think, well, investigations are a form of harassment. Stop and frisk policy, which they consider blatantly racist, would be fine in this case, because somebody could just say, oh, I've seen this person before, and I've seen him dealing drugs before, so I would like to stop him and frisk him.
State charges you with a crime, and when you hit court, the jury is supposed to presume innocence and make the state make their case. The prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But that means there's a police investigation, not a background check.
Okay, another thing that they're talking about is a police investigation for a crime. But the Democrats were saying over and over and over again that this is not a trial. This is a job interview. And now these people from the Real News, they're saying, well, it's not a trial, but you have to apply the same standards of a trial in order to actually get due process. Well, do people just go on trial based on somebody's account of something without do people just get arrested based on somebody else saying something? It doesn't work that way. That's where the right to legal representation comes from. The Miranda rights, all of that stuff has the Democrats and these people who are not technically Democrats, they're the far left progressives. They have traditionally said, well, we need to extend defendants' rights. Well, in this case, they're basically throwing defendants' rights in the trash. Anybody who's been accused of a crime is not automatically put on trial for it.
Now, what Dr. Ford accused Kavanaugh of is a crime. Now, it may be under the laws of Maryland in 1982, there's a year-long statute of limitations. Right. So the Montgomery County Police, who issued a statement saying they can't pursue this because of that statute of limitation, it doesn't change the fact in what's, as they say, not a criminal case, but a job interview. Well, in a job interview, you've been alleged to have committed a crime. That's more than, you got a bad reference from somebody. Then, if you believe Dr. Ford, and everyone talks about how persuasive she was, how credible she was, but then you come and pat her on the head and say, oh, as if it's a child speaking, which is how these people often treat women, is like a child speaking.
Well, if you're first of all, when she was testifying, she behaved like a child, and her voice was often childlike, and she was behaving like the most that was her pose the entire time, as the vulnerable victim and everything. That was the only thing that made the testimony in any way compelling. If it had been somebody who was much more robust and I want to say less feminine, I guess, nobody would have believed the testimony. It would have been a joke. People would have been like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" So it was somebody. There were many people who said that her testimony, her voice, everything she did was basically childlike. She behaved like a child. She even said at one point that her lawyers didn't appraise her. They didn't communicate to her the option of the Senate Judiciary investigators going to California and speaking to her directly at her home. So she behaved like a child the entire time. Her entire conduct during this whole thing was of somebody who thinks that the events that happened to the events that happened to her today are out of her control. Another thing she said, if you looked at the testimony, was that she didn't report the assault to the FBI because she didn't know how to she didn't know how to contact the FBI. How does somebody not know how to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation, yet they are able to send an anonymous letter or a letter asking for anonymity to her congresswoman, who then communicates it to Dianne Feinstein? Okay, it's a little harder to find a congressperson than to find the FBI. And also, it happens to be that one of the people that is a known acquaintance of Christine Ford is a former FBI agent. So I would say that's actually evidence of her lying to Congress.
Thinking, oh, yes, she means well, but now we can ignore it. Well, if you believe it's a credible accusation, you don't have to believe there's enough for conviction. As long as you've got enough that a grand jury might say, there's enough here for an indictment, well, then you need to have a criminal investigation. This background check investigation doesn't clear up.
So he just contradicted himself again. He said earlier, maybe like less than 2 minutes ago, that the statute of limitations had expired and etc. So now there is no crime. You can't investigate a crime for which the statute of limitations has expired. And furthermore, the grand jury indictment. Would a grand jury really have indicted Brett Kavanaugh based on the testimony of one accuser, one credible accuser, the other two accusers being kind of not even close to, because those accusations, the Deborah Ramirez and Julie Swetnick ones were made during right after the Ford accusations were made public. So how are you supposed to investigate any of those? How are you supposed to proceed with them? And how can you say that a grand jury would have indicted them? And by the way, the real news has typically in these cases, when it comes to Russiagate, said that there is not enough evidence to proceed with an indictment, that the indictments are jokes. Okay, the Russia indictment, for example, on those trolls probably has almost as much proof as, maybe even more proof than what we have here.
Anything. You can't pursue lines of questioning. You can't subpoena people. You can't have it both ways. Yell about due process and eliminate the investigators.
So one of the things, though, that since you raised these issues, I think it's important you had to probe this from the three of us. That's what the FBI was supposed to do. The FBI was supposed to do this investigation. There's been all kinds of commentary and people writing op-eds in the Washington Post, pieces in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, many other journals, talking about the people who pleaded with the FBI to be questioned about what happened. People who were his roommates, people who lived in his dormitory, people who drank with him, people who were his friends and colleagues while he was in law school at Yale, and more. And that was completely ignored. You're talking about doing a background investigation. That wasn't even really done.
Yeah, but I think it's very important that the Democratic Party, to a large extent, played along with this game. Why did they accept a week-long extension to a background investigation?
So this is more bullshit from them, where they're trying to say that look, we had all of this stuff where we could throw at him, and the New Yorker said this, and these guys said this, and everything, and is irrelevant. Okay, when you're talking about his college roommate who has been known to have had an adversarial relationship with Kavanaugh back from his time, I think it was at Yale. So he has evidence that Brett Kavanaugh drank a lot. That is not evidence corroborating the actual crime committed, because it doesn't. Look, when you're doing an investigation, there's a reason they talk a lot about things, about the metaphor for casting a net. So why do they call it that? When you put a net out to catch fish, you don't pull up the net and leave it wide and with no and loose. Okay, you pull the net up and tighten it. You get it more narrow in order to trap the fish and possibly the crustaceans that you might be eating, so that you can narrow it down. This does not narrow it down. It actually gives evidence that pretty much widens it. You would say, well, okay, he drank a lot during college, but we already knew that he drank while he was in high school. What does that change? When you're talking about the Sweatnick allegations of the gangbangs and everything, again, different time, different action, different people. Okay, so it doesn't have anything to do with the corroborating the case. So I think we're going to move away from this video. I might go back and watch some of it later, although I don't know why, because they're rehashing the same old crap over and over again. So I'll tell you the next thing that we're going to talk about. So again, I said we were going to talk a little about winners and losers here. So Susan Collins, who is a Republican senator from Maine, has won a lot of brownie points from the public for what she did during and possibly more than she ever has in her entire life. Will that help her get reelected in Maine the next time she's up for reelection? I don't know. Maine is generally a little more liberal of a state. They used to have two Republican senators. I think the other senator was Olympia Snowe, and she was I think voted out in favor of I don't even know if she was voted out. I think she might have just retired. So Olympia Snowe has been replaced by Angus King. And this was only a couple years ago. Oh my, that's not the best photo of her. She actually, this photo is a little better. This is the one yeah, she used to look pretty good. And yeah, I don't care if people object to me commenting on senators' looks, because, screw you. But we don't have to look at people who are basically, they have catcher's mitt face. And by the way, Susan Collins does not. She kind of looks kind of past her prime, if I may say so. So yes, this is about as chauvinist of a broadcast as I'm gonna have, because it's time to finally stop with the bullshit. Okay. So yeah, Snow, I think, retired in 2012, and she was replaced by Angus King, who's up for re-election today. And King happens to be an independent, and he was elected as an independent. And when you get elected or get into office as an independent, I think that it lends to you a lot of credibility. Okay, and he also served at one point as governor of Maine for 8 years. So who else can we talk about becoming an independent? Joe Manchin, who was the Democrat who ended up crossing the lines to support the nominee. Now, earlier I had a question from Arjun, who's from India, as to why Collins's speech was so critical. Well, if not for the fact that Susan Collins had come forward and said, well, I am voting for Justice or Judge Kavanaugh, Manchin would have been the key vote because it would have been 49-49 between the Democrats and the Republicans, and there would have been another senator who was from Montana who was supposed to go home and see his daughter's wedding, Steve Daines, and you would have had two Republicans. So he would have had to fly back and vote for Kavanaugh. The other on the fence Republican that was talked about, there were two: Jeff Flake, who ended up voting for Kavanaugh, and then of course there was Lisa Murkowski, who ended up saying that she wouldn't vote for him. She ended up voting present, which means that she does not vote either way, meaning her vote kind of goes to waste. So she would have been possibly the vote, enough of a vote if Collins had voted no to torpedo the nomination. Now, with her vote for yes, Manchin could come forward and vote yes as well without saying, well, he could just cop out and say, well, I wasn't the deciding vote. But, I thought I thought that the investigation was enough to convince me. Senator Joe Manchin III, so this is from earlier this year, January 2018. Senator Joe Manchin III of West Virginia told colleagues on Tuesday that he intended to run for re-election this year after all, and ending an anxiety-filled making flirtation with retirement and easing Democratic fears that the most conservative Democrat in the Senate was about to effectively hand his seat to a Republican. So Joe Manchin is typically thought of as kind of a turncoat by the progressives. He was a senator for he was a senator elected in 2012. This was the year Barack Obama ran for re-election, and Manchin won 60% of the vote in a state where Obama lost by almost the same margin. So Joe Manchin did extremely well for a Democrat in a state that voted against Obama. So he had proven that he could attract the votes of people who were, Republicans. In an interview, Mr. Manchin said he repeatedly expressed his frustration to Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, and other colleagues, telling them that this place sucks, before finally signaling Tuesday morning to Mr. Schumer's aide that he would file his re-election paperwork before West Virginia's deadline on Saturday. I was very vocal, Mr. Manchin said, adding, they read between the lines. Even as Democrats won a reprieve, Mr. Manchin's discontent illustrated the divisions in their party between those from states that President Trump easily carried and the more liberal bloc of senators, at least a half dozen of whom are positioning themselves for possible White House runs. The rift contributed to the government shutdown over the weekend and the Monday decision by a group of moderates to force the government's reopening. It also will have to be bridged if Democrats have any hope of regaining the Senate in November, when they must defend 10 seats in states that Mr. Trump won, while winning Republican-held seats in difficult states like Tennessee, Nevada, and Arizona. So at this time of writing, I don't think that they're going to win the one in Tennessee at all. The person who was running in that race on the Democratic side, Phil Bredesen, stated that he would vote against Kavanaugh if he was in that position, and that, I believe, has sunk his candidacy, and his poll numbers will probably continue to drop approaching election day in November. I've said this point blank: if people like me can't win from red states, you'll be in the minority the rest of your life, Mr. Manchin said about his conversations with other Democrats about the need to tolerate more moderate lawmakers. The frustration was all the more striking coming a day after Mr. Manchin celebrated with Republicans and Democrats in the so-called Common Sense Coalition, the bipartisan group that forced the government back open and vowed to lead negotiations over immigration, the budget, and other matters. But even as they celebrated, Mr. Schumer was being harshly attacked for what liberals saw as a capitulation to vulnerable senators like Mr. Manchin, who opposed the shutdown. The pragmatic Mr. Schumer has made no apologies for his efforts to protect Democrats from conservative states, offering Mr. Manchin plum committee assignments in the aftermath of the 2016 election when Mr. Trump was wooing the senator for a cabinet post. Senate Democrats had to hold something of an intervention to persuade Mr. Manchin to run for re-election. Recognizing the statement that his abrupt retirement would send about centrism in the political bind it would leave Democrats in this November, Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, another Trump state Democrat, prompted other moderates to lobby Mr. Manchin. Senator Joe Donnelly of Indiana, who is also facing a difficult reelection this fall, left Mr. Manchin a voice message on Monday stating, "We need you," according to a Democrat who heard the message but spoke on the condition of anonymity to protect private communications. Asked Tuesday afternoon about Mr. Manchin's decision to go forward with his reelection campaign, Mr. Donnelly grinned and said, "He's a great senator. I'm really excited he's going to continue." But Senate Democrats appeared nearly stricken earlier in the day when asked about Mr. Manchin, and two of them later said they believed he was unlikely to run as late as Tuesday morning. Blah, blah, blah. A former governor who has remained popular even as the state has drifted from its Democratic roots, Mr. Manchin is most likely the only West Virginia Democrat who could retain the seat. And with the filing deadline days away, it would have been highly unlikely that the party could have put up a competitive candidate. Mr. Manchin indicated he would submit his paperwork on Friday in person at the state capitol in Charleston if the Senate is out of session by then. So then it goes on and on and repeats the same stuff. I will tell you this, okay? The issue with Joe Manchin is, for me, I don't think I would ever support him. I think he's kind of a corporate whore. His daughter is the EpiPen girl who she kind of gouged the prices for that device in order to, and she's I think one of the chief executive or one of the executive officers of Mylan, which is a corporation that produces EpiPens. So I think that Joe Manchin is a piece of crap, but I think he might have come out of this as the smartest man in the U.S. Senate, and that's in terms of strategy, because Joe Manchin, we're talking about Arjun's question here too. Joe Manchin is hated by the progressive left. He's considered basically the turncoat. He's considered the guy who, the corporate Democrat, the classic, just a person. I'll tell you what. The reaction to this will be from the progressive left, the TYT people, and people beyond them, from the Real News Network and places like that. They will ask, if this is what we get from Democratic senators, why even vote for Democrats at all? Why vote for them at all in any of these states? And the issue that they're going to have is that Manchin, I don't like him. I think he's pretty much caught lightning in a bottle here, and I'll explain why. The Democrats, if they don't have Joe Manchin, they don't have anything in West Virginia. They don't have a single other statewide office there. I don't even know how many legislators they have in the state legislature. Besides, some people in the House of Delegates or whatever. So in this race, you have Joe Manchin, and this was the result from the primary election where he was up against a very progressive candidate, Paula Jean Swearingen, she was, by the way, one of the people from Justice Democrats, which is Cenk Uyghur's organization, or former organization. I think he's not affiliated with them anymore due to his own sexist blog posts. But in any case, Joe Manchin just destroyed her by an almost, it says here, it could have very well been, it's a 70-30 margin, okay? And one could wonder, maybe it would have been more if more people had gone out to vote in the primary. In the Republican primary, there wasn't even close to the amount of votes as in the Democratic one. Okay, Manchin won by far the most votes of anybody. Of course, there was more competition within the Republican primary. And I think you have to believe that there were certainly some people who were saying, well, why do we even need to vote for a Republican candidate when Joe Manchin has a number of positions that do line up with Donald Trump, and some of them, they don't. I would say Joe Manchin is he's very much a business Democrat. He's very much somebody who says, well, I'm not here in order to do ideological warfare. I'm here to pursue the interests that I have, and I don't know about the interests of West Virginia, but the interests that he has. And that's basically what he's done as a senator for West Virginia. And I think he's done well doing it. It's not something, I don't think it's the type of politics I would endorse. I of course, would want somebody a lot more hard and ideological, somebody like Rand Paul, somebody like, Mike Lee to a certain extent. If you're talking about in the House, there's, what's that guy's name? Justin Amash. So those are things that I think are big differences between Joe Manchin's approach and my approach to who I would vote for. And unfortunately, what's going to happen for the Democrats is, unfortunately, if you're a Democrat, I don't think that Joe Manchin's days in the party are necessarily long. Now, if he gets reelected, which I think at this point, based on what he did this weekend, he helped his reelection effort somewhat, but he's taken a gamble, because now that he's voted for Kavanaugh, any of the liberal super PACs and other fundraising organizations are going to pull their funding from his race, because people will ask, well, why are we funding this idiot who is basically helping Donald Trump with his main goal of remaking the judiciary? You said to us for months that the Supreme Court is so important that we cannot tolerate a justice like Gorsuch or a justice like Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. And yet, who's voted for both of them? Joe Manchin. Some of the other Republican candidates or Democratic candidates in red states, in Trump voting states, like Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Donnelly, voted for Gorsuch, but they didn't vote for Kavanaugh. Joe Manchin is the only Democrat to have voted for both, and he is going to be basically thrown under the bus by the fundraisers. But at this point, why would he even need the fundraisers? He could just go out in front of the voters and say, well, you see, I am a fair-minded person. I vote the way I want to, and I don't need Chuck Schumer to tell me how to vote. And therefore, why do you need this guy who's a full-on Republican to represent you? I'm just as good. That would be, he would easily be able to coast that way. And his opponent, Patrick Morrisey, would have to basically build on other votes that Manchin has done that have been contrary to Trump's position, if he's trying to woo all those Democratic Trump voters that would vote for both Trump and Manchin. So I think that at this point, we'll take a look at this video. This is from, not this video, this video. This is from 2001, and this is from Jim Jeffords.
Measured by the number of students moved out of the public schools. In order to best represent my state of Vermont, my own conscience, and principles I have stood for my whole life, I will leave the Republican Party and become an independent. Control of the Senate. Sorry for that. Control of the Senate will be changed by my decision. I'm sorry for that interruption, but I understand it. I will make this change and will caucus with the Democrats for organizational purposes. Once the conference report on the tax bill is sent to the President, I gave my word to the President that I would not intercept or try to intervene in the signing of that bill. My colleagues, many of them my friends for years, may find it difficult in their hearts to befriend me any longer. Many of my supporters will.
Okay, so this is not to go towards the end, but this was Jim Jeffords, who was a Vermont senator back in the it was the late 90s to early 2000s. I think it was the guy who actually preceded Bernie Sanders as senator from Vermont. And he was originally a Republican, and he left the Republican Party due to certain budget disagreements with the Bush administration. And what he ended up doing was swinging the Senate from a Republican majority at the time, with Senator Trent Lott as the majority leader, to the Democratic majority with Senator Tom Daschle. And in reality, that didn't last very long, because I think the Republicans gained back the Senate with a special election and then later won the midterms in any case. But Joe Manchin has the option of ditching the Democratic Party, and it would probably establish him as one of the most powerful senators in Congress. And this is why Joe Manchin could be the big winner of this whole Kavanaugh fight. If you're talking about it being winners versus losers, the big losers would be Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi, and people like Cory Booker and other members of that committee. Nancy Pelosi's not in the Senate, but she kind of looked like an idiot many times speaking about this whole matter. You would have, there are a number of people who are on the Democratic side that have really lost a lot of credibility. The ones that voted no, that were in red states, Heitkamp, Claire McCaskill. You have also the guy, what's the guy's name? Joe Donnelly from Indiana. They have lost a lot of momentum, because now they're being thought of as basically these, in Indiana, I cannot imagine that the smearing of Brett Kavanaugh, who is a Catholic, just like many Indiana residents and everything, and a lot of them are Notre Dame people, and he's all into this whole going to church thing that people tend to do. I think a lot of them will object to Joe Donnelly basically saying, well, I'm not going to vote for him. I think that basically what these people did, the red state Democrats that voted against him, is that they said it's more important that we continue to attract support from the Democratic base and from their donor base, which is, pro Planned Parenthood people and stuff like that, and people like that. They found that to be the key issue the entire time. Now, I'm not saying that's not important. I recognize that if you're a Democratic politician, that's a very important part of building your organization in order to win. It's not going to win you re-election in Indiana or in North Dakota, in my opinion. I would say that what they did will probably sink the election chances. It's in North Dakota, by the way. Heidi Heitkamp, at the latest polls showed that let me see, she was really down pretty bad, and it's almost insurmountable. So this is Heidi Heitkamp, who is the current senator. Yes, she looks pretty red. And her opponent is this Kevin Cramer guy. And the Republicans had much more enthusiasm during the primaries than she did. And she was up against, she didn't have any significant opposition. And then now she's down by 12 points. Either 9 or 12 points based on two different polls. And the seat is already called a lean Republican one by even the Daily Kos, which is an extremely progressive source. So she is not going to win that race, in my opinion. The one in Indiana, I think, is a little more difficult to gauge. But after that, we'll go back to what I'm saying about Joe Manchin. So he is technically up, 2 points in one poll or 1 point in another. I think that in reality, he's going to lose the race. I don't think that this Joe Donnelly is going to succeed. And people are going to, and this is before the Kavanaugh vote. So he's going to really take it in the face as a result of what's going on with the Kavanaugh nomination, in my opinion. And you can dispute that. You can say whatever you want. What they did is a pretty big departure from the public opinion of their voters. And I think that if the Republicans are smart, they will actually run ads to the constituents in those states and get them motivated to take out their revenge on Joe Donnelly, take out their revenge on through the ballot box, against Heitkamp and Joe Donnelly. They'll say, well, does this really represent your view? Does it represent the way that you look at the system of criminal justice? No, probably not. And why is Joe Manchin now going to be, if he crosses the part, even like whether or not he remains a Democrat or not, he is going to be one of the most powerful senators in the Senate, because on any close vote, people are going to be asking what Joe is voting. And if he goes independent, it's a further obstacle to the Democrats who have been, who he's been a member of from now on. If he becomes an independent, then basically any time, which is not going to be this year, by the way, I fully predict now that the Democrats have a very, very low chance of winning the Senate. It's almost an afterthought for me now. The House is still going to be difficult, but the Democrats are going to probably lose the Senate again and have an even larger margin of defeat, probably something like 54 to 46 all told, which would return it to the 2014 through 2016 levels. And then even if Manchin is reelected, he could jump the line and it would end up being 54 to 45 to 1. And the one vote would basically caucus with the Republicans, and you would have an even more difficult task for Chuck Schumer and his colleagues to, they would have harder and harder tasks ahead of them in order to really galvanize any opposition to anything Trump wants to pass through the Senate that doesn't require the 60 vote threshold to avoid filibustering, which I'm not sure what's left. I think budget votes are kind of subject to that. Not entirely sure. Anyway, I think we're through everything. There is this video of Rand Paul being harassed at the airport, if you want to watch that.
Survivors of sexual violence. What do you have to say to women who've been sexually assaulted? I can step down past it.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. You can't keep us out with that bag.
Is this your stance? Is your stance silence? You have 3 women who are all sexual violence survivors who are here asking you, taking time out of their lives. Is this your stance, Rand Paul? Silence?
Senator, can you at least comment on the investigation? Can you comment on whether you will call for a full investigation and not a sham investigation with just 4 witnesses?
Will you support a full investigation into the allegations by Professor Ford, Debbie Ramirez, Julie Svetfield, and anyone else who comes forward?
Okay.
Senator Paul, is this all you have to say? Nothing.
You have nothing to say to women who are survivors of assault. You won't comment on whether or not you will support a full investigation.
Senator Paul, what will you do to protect the Supreme Court? Protect our democracy for generations.
So these are all bullshit questions. What are you going to do to protect the Supreme Court? I don't know. Vote on people that I think belong on the Supreme Court. Maybe exercise my own discretion as to which Supreme Court nominees comport to my views, not to your views. These people, remember, Rand Paul has basically curb stomped anybody who's run against him in Kentucky. So what do these people think that they're going to actually impact his votes? It's just ridiculous. And they're basically behaving like look at this. Look at it this way. If I were to see Senator Booker in New Jersey, and I was to harass him at the airport, it would probably have literally no impact on what he thinks. First of all, there's no way to know that these people live in Kentucky. And in my case, I of course don't live in New Jersey because I want to live like a human being and not like some sort of animal living in the trash. Second of all, you can already look at the polling. You can look at the people who write to you. You can look at the people that are consistently, communicating with your office all the time, and you can see basically what their views are. And the people that have supported Rand Paul, or to contrast Cory Booker, are completely different people. And Tom says, I think it's funny how they go after Rand. He's the most libertarian senator we have. I'll close with this. And thanks for Tom for tuning in. By the way, check out his channel as well. I don't think Arjun has a channel yet, but when he does, he'll let us know. The fact that they want to harass this person, who, by the way, we don't see any security detail around Rand Paul, even though he's been assaulted at his home by a person, a neighbor, even though he was one of the targets of the James Hodgkinson assassination attempt last year at the baseball game. These people don't have any self-respect. They should just leave him the fuck alone. Leave him the fuck alone. There are other senators who you should probably, what they did. They didn't just do it to him. Let's be fair. They tried to do it to that John Kennedy guy, the one that looks like basically some sort of paper bag puppet from Louisiana. I'm just saying he looks like that. I think he's actually pretty smart, but he is a little like grotesque looking. They basically tried to jump in his way and prevent him from walking into the Senate. It's stupid. It's ridiculous. It's not really political activism. It's actually just personal harassment of a person who, if you don't like him so much, vote for somebody else if you can. I don't think that this is going to change the minds of people from Kentucky. And I'm actually writing a long project now talking about how this type of messaging, it doesn't impact the people from rural areas of the country. Those people are not going to respond to this hysterical bullshit. Okay, those people, and I work with some of those people. I live in an urban area. They have different attitudes. Even if they might not have the same attitude across every rural area, whether it's in Oregon or in Wyoming or whatever, but they have more in common between them if you go around these states than they do with some asshole from Portland or some person from Lexington, which is basically the hipster mecca of Kentucky. So that's about it. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. I will try to upload a version of this or several segments of this to the Bold Like a Leopard channel, which does not have live streaming capability now. I hope you have a good Sunday, and I hope the Lions continue to beat the shit out of the Packers, which I've been following on my phone. But that's it. Please subscribe to this channel, like this video, share this video, subscribe to the other channel, Bold Like a Leopard, and comment when it uploads. And take it easy, guys.